Hello and welcome to the Journal. I'm Steve Kendall. The conflict between Hamas and the State of Israel is about 2 months old now, entering its 11th week, with obviously no end where we see the end of the fighting for this and the contesting that's going on there. Joining us to talk about this particular issue and the history of how we got to this point and maybe where we'll go once things settle back down as much as they can in the Middle East is Dr. Marc Simon from the Department of Political Science here at Bowling Green State University. Marc, appreciate you being here. This is the kind of topic that everybody has multiple opinions on and multiple facts on and see things through different lenses. So we know that as we talk about this, not everybody's probably going to be happy with some of the things we say, but the reality is it's a contentious issue, and it's an issue where obviously if it was easy to solve, it would have been solved years ago. So thank you for being here again. Let's talk a little about the history. I know you could go back thousands of years, but the reality is much of that isn't impactful right now. So talk about where this sort of started, and then we can talk in the next segment about where we are right now. Well,
thanks. I'd like to maybe shorten the history a bit, although it is all very important. You know, the State of Israel was created in 1948. The British left their mandate that they'd had since World War I to rule the area of Palestine. The UN thought about a partition plan. In the end, the Israelis accepted the partition. The Arab countries around did not, and there was a war, and the Israelis called that the War of Independence in 1948. And that's what established the State of Israel initially. And it also created 750,000 Palestinian refugees and some of the problems we have now. But I want to fast forward a little bit to 1967, which is the war which established the occupied territories and the situation we've really been dealing with since that time. So. And I know we have a map here. I don't know if your viewers can see that. So in 1967, there was another war where Israel fought its Arab neighbors. Israel actually initiated the war. It's called the Six-Day War. It was very short. Israel kind of preemptively attacked because they expected Egypt to be attacking. And they ended up having a really unexpected great deal of military success. They took over the Gaza Strip, which had been part of Egypt, and the West Bank of the Jordan River area, which had been part of Jordan, and then also from Syria, the Golan Heights, which is up north. Finally, they also took over the whole Sinai Peninsula, which isn't really on the map as much, but it's south of the Gaza Strip. It's a big desert area, historically part of Egypt. So Israel takes over these territories, but they don't annex them. They occupy them, and that's a term, a legal term, but it's also kind of a de facto situation. So the occupied territories, especially the West Bank and Gaza, where the vast majority of, I can't even say majority now, but most Palestinians live in the region. There's actually about around 6 million Palestinian refugees from all the wars since 1948 that are recognized by the UN. Actually, I think the big country with the largest number is Jordan. All right. So the conflict is really about land. It's about who's going to control the land. The Palestinians feel that the creation of Israel, and then especially the Six-Day War, deprived them of a potential homeland, of an independent state. And the Israelis, of course, have a state but want security. They want to be safe and live in this area where they can get along with all the people and their neighbors. And that's never been the case. And so those viewers that have a long memory will know there's always been conflicts going on in this region, right? And unfortunately, the current conflict looks a lot like some past ones, but some of the names are changed, right?
Now, when you talk about the Palestinians, did at one time they actually have an area where they lived? Have they been moved off of that? Is that part of this whole thing? I mean, have they been forced to leave land that they believe is theirs? Because again, this is such a complex situation. Was there ever a state of Palestine that was run by Palestinians?
Well, we'd have to go back for hundreds of years
farther.
there.
Okay. Yeah.
But the point is both Israeli people and, I mean, the Jewish people have a couple thousand-year history in this region. The Palestinians do as well.
Okay.
There's not really a point of getting into who was there first.
Right.
Because if who was there first defines who owns the land, well,
not necessarily.
That's not how we would work anywhere else in the world. There's never been, the state of Palestine was not a state, it was a colony run by the British, between World War I and World War, 1948. And before that, it was part of the Ottoman Empire, and the Ottomans didn't really have states as the way we think of them. They had regions, and I mean, the state system didn't come to this part of the world until the 20th century, where we started drawing hard boundaries and things.
Yeah, so it was just sort of a large area that had multiple different kinds of populations.
But when Israel was created, of course, like I said, 750,000 Palestinians who were living there left. But it's complicated. So one of the things I want to establish is that, each group, they're not homogenous. It's not good guys and bad guys, right? There's different groups. So, for instance, on the Palestinian side, our viewers may not know, but there are actually over 1 million Palestinian Arabs who live in Israel and are citizens and can vote. Okay?
Yeah.
So it's not like they're all living in the West Bank and Gaza and in the countries surrounding it in refugee camps. The Palestinians also have two major factions.
Okay.
And if I can go over this quickly.
Sure.
So Hamas is one of the factions, and the other one is called Fatah. Okay. And our viewers with a sense of history might remember Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian Liberation Organization. That was a group that initially tried to push for Palestinian statehood and actually just recognition of the Palestinians as an independent group of people with a national identity that wanted to have statehood there. Right. They used terrorist tactics a lot through the 1960s and 70s to get their issues on the agenda and to do some of the things that are happening here. But for various reasons, in 1988, the Palestinian faction Fatah, which was the PLO's group, renounced terrorism and entered into some negotiations with Israel that resulted in a peace agreement in 1993, the Oslo Accords.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the Oslo Accords was the attempt to try to take this land conflict from 1967 and move it toward a two-state solution. In other words, take the West Bank and the Gaza Strip in some form and create a Palestinian state on those lands that could live in peace with Israel, right? And Arafat and the Fatah faction agreed to that. And that's when we created this thing called the Palestinian Authority.
Okay, which we've heard about in this situation as well. Right?
And they run the West Bank. That's a governmental, they call it the authority because they didn't want to call it a state, right? But the idea of Oslo was, let's create a roadmap where we give some sovereignty to Palestinians. So they turned over 6 or 7 towns in the West Bank to complete Palestinian administration, right? So they run the local governments, they police, they pick up the trash, they do all that, right? And then there were other areas where there was still Israeli presence, and then there was these third areas where they were going to negotiate later, right? Okay. So the idea was, step by step, the Palestinian Authority would evolve into a responsible government, and we would have a two-state solution by now. This was 1993, right?
Now, unfortunately, we need to take a break here. We come back, we'll pick it up in 1993. I hate to interrupt you, but yeah, because the continuity is there.
Sure.
Back in just a moment, we're talking about the situation in Gaza, the state of Israel, the war between Hamas and Israel. Back in just a moment, here on The Journal. Thank you for staying with us on The Journal. Our guest is Dr. Marc Simon from the Bowling Green State University Department of Political Science. And we're talking about the Middle East. We're talking about Gaza and Israel, the current situation. We're working our way through history to find out how we got here and why we got here. You were in 1993. We're at the point where the Oslo Accords have started to go into place. And there's obviously, apparently, a movement by both sides, the sides that were involved then, to go to a two-state solution. So pick it up and context that for me as I've sort of shambled through it, but explain where we are at that point.
So I established in 1993, there's this faction, the Fatah faction of the Palestinians that evolved from the PLO. that's running the West Bank, right? So, but then we have a split. So in 1987, there was an intifada, an uprising that actually helped create the basis for the Oslo Accords. But in that split, the Palestinians had a split, and a group emerged out of that resistance movement called Hamas.
Okay.
Hamas has a very different ideology than Fatah. Hamas does not believe that Israel has a right to exist. At least at that point they didn't. They use violence to try to drive Israel out of the region. They're also Islamist, and they want to establish a religious state of Palestine. Okay, and so that movement grew out of the Intifada, and the Fatah faction that negotiated peace was very, hopeful and popular, but you had this militant faction that said, no, we don't want to do this, this is selling out, right? And so what ended up happening is Hamas started to use a lot of terror attacks to undermine the Oslo process. So they were attacking in Israel proper. This was creating reactions in Israel, which, as normal, they felt that they weren't getting peace. Here they signed a peace agreement, now we're getting terrorist attacks.
And things have gotten worse, actually.
It helped to destroy the Oslo process, right? The other thing that happened was the Palestinians had elections in 2006, I believe, and at that point there was enough division and that Hamas actually won those elections by a small margin.
So they're now the governmental
they
authority
won the Palestinian Authority elections, but there was a split and a sort of a mini civil war emerged where basically Hamas ends up going to Gaza and they run the Gaza Strip, and the Palestinian Authority under Fatah runs the West Bank. Okay. So now that we have that, there's two factions, one that's much more violent, one that's less. The same thing goes in Israel as well. You've had governments that negotiated the Oslo Accords and have been promoting peace and different kinds of solutions. And then you've had governments that have resisted those, and it tends to break down on the left and right. And the thing about Israel is it's just as politically divided as the U.S. It's about a 50-50 split, right? Between those on the left or in the center who would probably favor some kind of process to lead toward a two-state solution, and those on the right, really led by mostly Benjamin Netanyahu since the 1996 when he was elected for the first time, who don't want a two-state solution, who think that this is fine, we can keep going and keep adding Israeli settlers to the West Bank, and that, we can manage this, right? So what ended up happening was, what's happened since 2006, I mean, this is like 17 years, nothing's happened as far as a solution to the land conflict, right? And what started to happen in the recent weeks before the October 7th attack was, first the Abraham Accords, where a couple of countries, the UAE, Morocco, signed a peace agreement with Israel. And then it was known that the Saudis were negotiating a normalization of relations with Israel.
And they sort of carry a lot of weight within the Arab,
and so the Hamas group decided that they couldn't let their issue go off the agenda, because if the Saudis and other neighbors make peace with Israel, then nobody's going to be caring about the Palestinian cause.
In the minds of Hamas, that's their interpretation of it. Right.
So I think that's part of the reason they use these terrorist tactics, and they committed a mass atrocity. You can call it lots of things. It was just horrific. But the strategy behind it was terrorism. Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, knowing that Israel would respond with overwhelming force and kill up to, I guess, 19,000 Palestinians so far in Gaza, right?
Yeah, and in the process blow up the movement that the Saudis now would be in an incredibly difficult position to make peace with Israel, or to sign an agreement with Israel.
So now what they've done is what the strategy of the terrorist tactics is. They've gotten their issue back on the agenda. They've stopped the Saudis and other Arab states from signing peace agreements or working on that. And there's a lot of pressure to solve this land conflict, which has been going on since at least 1967.
Right. Now, obviously, we're seeing the conflicts in a much more upfront way than we have in terms of being able to watch what goes on. You talked about the political split in Israel, And for a lot of people, Israel is a monolith. It's the state of Israel and that sort of thing. But within that, you talked about the political divisions, and Netanyahu tends to be far to the right. Now, don't really want to, they're comfortable with the status quo. Is that sort of their position? We'll just keep doing what we've been doing for the last 20 years. And what is their end game, though? Is their end game to...
I think that what's been revealed is that they don't really have the end game. I think is essentially annexing the territories eventually and making a one-state solution, which there are variants of that which are not, which are reasonable. But they've been going along thinking, and see, the other thing is Hamas has been in power in Gaza for quite a while. They're supported by the Iranians. They have the ability to make very inaccurate but lethal rockets, and every so often, about 4 times in the last, since 2012, they've launched rocket attacks at Israel. The Israeli government responds with air attacks on Gaza. Those things have usually lasted a few weeks, and that's been it. And the Israeli governments on the right felt like that was an acceptable price to keep things the way they are. But now with this attack, all bets are off because everyone realizes we can't just let this fester for decades.
For the last 20-some years, it's just been this sort of back and forth situation. We come back because we're at the end of this segment. Is there a political advantage to the current Israeli government pushing hard on this? That's the question I'm going to ask you when we come back, because is it more than simply the conflict we've dealt with for 20 years, but is there really a political agenda for them to stay in power? And it's a question that people ask. Back in just a moment with Dr. Marc Simon from the Bowling Green State University Department of Political Science. Back in a moment. We're talking about the current situation in the Middle East with Hamas and the State of Israel, but it's obviously a much bigger group of participants. You talked a little about the split in Israel in terms of the politics there. Is there a political reason why Israel has moved the way they have this time, maybe compared to the more limited responses? Is this a reaction to the incredible severity? There's no words that can really capture what happened on October 7th. But is there a political thing behind this as well as let's find just an overall solution from the current government in Israel? So they don't really have an end game, but is it a political thing to keep them in power as well?
Well, any Israeli government would have responded in overwhelming fashion to a mass murder on this scale, largest one-day death toll since the Holocaust for the Jewish people, right? So that's part of it. Netanyahu is faced with a lot of backlash internally because people are blaming him for creating a lot of internal division in Israel over his issues with the Supreme Court reforms and just creating, being neglectful and not allowing this to happen, right? So a lot of people are blaming him, which is understandable. The strategy here is really important, though, and the United States is trying to get Israel to see that, we've been here before.
Right.
The U.S. has experienced these kind of situations. When you try to militarily destroy essentially a guerrilla operation, you can destroy the fighters, you can destroy the tunnels, you can destroy the weapons, but it will regenerate.
Yeah, you can't destroy the idea.
Right?
That's
so,
the situation.
I mean, the easiest example is the United States invaded Afghanistan after 9/11 to depose the Taliban government. Who's in power now? The Taliban, right? The Israelis have lots of experience with this too. In 1982, they invaded Lebanon to drive the PLO out of northern Lebanon because they were launching rockets into northern Israel. And the Israelis had had enough. And they're finally like, we're going to get rid of this threat forever. So they went and invade Lebanon, create all kinds of casualties, drive the PLO successfully out. They went to Tunisia. But guess what? A local militia in southern Lebanon was formed to resist the Israeli occupation called Hezbollah. That's another group you hear in the news, right? So where did Hezbollah come from? The attempt to get rid of the PLO, right? So if the Israelis just keep going in Gaza, they may get rid of Hamas, but there is Islamic Jihad. And there's also a lot of support for Hamas, not just in the West Bank, but around the Arab world. So it's not going to go away, and they need a strategy for afterward. And that would really, it would make a lot of sense if they went back to ceasefires and hostage exchanges and started thinking about the day after.
Stepped back from the precipice, back from the brink, kind of. Although there seems to be a lot of brinkmanship going on there. That's just like, so we're now at the point. Here's where we are. What is the future there? What should be or what could be the way to reach some sort of settlement that allows most of the people there to be comfortable with what's going on? Is that even possible? I mean,
all right, well, let's think
so
about
complex. It's
well,
so complex.
the last time we had some, all right, so in 1973 there was a war, and by 1979 there was a peace agreement between Egypt and Israel that returned the Sinai Peninsula. This is the Camp David Accords.
Jimmy Carter
mediated. So that was about 6 years. So I mean, if you're thinking that there could be progress on this issue, it's going to take a few years after this war goes away. But it has to, I mean, smart leaders could do smart things to stop it. First of all, they really need to stop the violence on both sides right now. The Israeli soldiers, as you can see from the recent news about Israeli hostages that were accidentally killed, they're in an untenable situation.
Sure.
In urban warfare. You know, if they're killing their own hostages in error, who knows how many civilians they're going to kill. And why? Because they're fighting in an urban environment. It's just very dangerous, right? Hamas needs to stop shooting too, because they've actually achieved what they needed to achieve with this thing.
In their mind, they've put it back on the front and center on the agenda again.
Right, and they don't gain any more by having more civilian deaths, and that's just part of their own brutality that they won't stop. But there needs to be a ceasefire, and then there has to be who's going to run Gaza, if not Hamas. The Palestinians in the West Bank, the Palestinian Authority, they don't really want to take that on because that's not necessarily a popular task for them, right?
Right. That's like almost like a no-win situation for them.
Would the Israelis come in and do it? Well, then the Israelis have to be there on the ground, and they're going to be targets, and it's going to be...
And it's just going to trigger another event like this.
So we've been through this a lot before in the region, and there are models out there. I don't know if we have time. We can get into some of the ideas.
Got a couple of minutes, I know. I'm going to try to ask you to capsulize that in a couple of minutes.
I mean, there have been situations where UN peacekeepers have been involved, certainly in Lebanon and other places. You know, outside forces could try to organize some kind of governance structure. It'd be hard to get Arab states to participate in that, but it might happen. There needs to be a way that Gaza can be actually operated and rebuilt.
Sure.
With some governance structure there that's not going to create the opportunity and the incentives for more violence.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned the other countries because obviously if they become involved, then they become targets for some of the groups you've mentioned that don't want things to settle down, that don't want, in essence, the kind of solution that appears to be that would make it calmer over there. They want an ultimate solution which leaves them in complete power, and that's a difficult. There's no negotiation. That's a difficult thing to solve.
So this is the problem. Every time we get to some peace in the Middle East in this situation, those on the far right, the violent factions, can use terror tactics to undermine support for peace. And that's included assassinations, which we've seen, Rabin and Sadat, who've made peace in the region. That includes terror attacks like Hamas launched after the Oslo Accords. That includes attacks by far-right Israelis on Palestinians. And so the violent factions can undermine the peace, and it's a dilemma that we faced for at least 50 years, and we're going to continue to face. But I think this is a moment where, because of the horrific suffering here, there's incentive now for the U.S., Europeans, the Israelis, the Arab countries to get together. There are a lot of models for a two-state solution to actually work on this again and try to create some hope. Because what we've learned now is that if you let this thing go for a couple of decades without giving the Palestinians some hope that things are going to improve, violent factions will emerge, and we'll go back to violence.
Yeah, because people get frustrated or whatever, and you have a situation where they just don't, as you said, they don't see any hope for any progress. Therefore, what does that leave them? Well, human nature being what it is, just on any other level, people get mad and get upset and then act.
I want to
Yeah.
emphasize
Yeah.
too that there are lots of Israelis that are working for peace in all through their country and in the West Bank and other places. There are lots of Palestinians that work with the Israelis. This is not a good guy, bad guy thing.
Right.
There are people of goodwill on both sides, but there are also violent factions. And we just, that has to be dealt with.
Yeah. So, well, I guess we'll leave it there for right now, and hopefully, when we have you back again sometime in the very near future, hopefully we can talk about movement towards some sort of an agreement like you've described, or versions of it that you've described, so that we can talk about some sort of solution there, because obviously, solutions in the Middle East and in other places, not just the Middle East, there are conflicts like this going on all over the world. In some cases, they just don't get this level of notoriety, and for no other reason other than they just don't. But this is a situation that obviously, I can remember growing up as a teenager, I was hearing about the 1967 war. So as you said, it's not something that started just on October 7th, and the solutions aren't going to be done in the next 2 months, but maybe there'll be some progress at some point. So appreciate your taking the time to do this and your insight into it too, because it's a difficult subject to talk about.
Thanks,
appreciate
Steve.
it again. Thank you, Mark. You can check us out at WBGU.org. You can watch us every Thursday night, 8 o'clock on WBGU-PBS. Enjoy the holidays. We will see you again next year. Good night and good luck.